Once again. Okay, well, we'll see. Sorry for that interruption. We'll have to go back and see later on where it left off originally. All right, let's see. Well, we're going to talk about Shamgar now. Shamgar is mentioned in one verse let's turn to the next one. In chapter 3, verse 31, Shamgar, it says, after him, that is after Ehud, Shamgar was Shamgar, the son of Anath. Now that's the goddess that we talk about, the goddess of war. Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. Not a lot said about Shamgar, but what's interesting about this is that there is there's a movie that's being made, an independent film that's being made about Shamgar. It's called Hold the Pass, I think is what it's called. Yeah, Hold the Pass, like is in a mountain pass. So anyway, that's going on. That's out there, I think, somewhere. You can look it up on YouTube to get the trailer if you want. But there's a movie being made. It's an independent film though, so it's not a real high budget one. But it looks kind of interesting anyway. I think it was just an excuse to put a lot of action into one movie. We have Shamgar. He's the son of, described as the son of Anath, or the son of Anath. That's Deborah. We'll get to her in a minute. That is, as we mentioned earlier, Anath is the goddess of war that is oftentimes worshipped by the Canaanites. And so that's led to a lot of speculation. What does it mean by the son of Anath here? So does that mean that Shamgar was somehow involved with the worship of the goddess of war? Some people have said, well, that maybe what that is a reference to the belief that this guy was a demigod, the human son of a god. Yeah, I think it's somebody's stereo. Others have said maybe he was considered guarded by her, by the Canaanites around him. Who thought, well, maybe Shamgar is blessed by Anath, therefore he cannot be killed, and this sort of thing. Or it could have just been the name of his mother. It's a female name, and obviously there would be a lot of people named after different gods and goddesses and things like that. There could be, and it maybe was just the name of his mother. But it would be kind of interesting that they would call him the son of his mother. But that's what it is, though. We don't know. It's just speculation from there. Well, the next judge, or should I say judgess, that we're going to talk about is that of Deborah. And Deborah is kind of an interesting case. Deborah is a prophetess. She is described in verse 4 of chapter 4 as as a prophetess and as a wife of Lapidoth. See if I got his name right there. I believe that's what it was. Yeah, Lapidoth. Which is interesting. You don't hear really a whole lot, with the exception of maybe Samson. You don't hear a whole lot about any of these other guys who they're married to, And Samson is only the occasion because his wife is part of the plot of the book or the story. But here's Deborah, and she judges Israel, and people would go up to her and they would take their cases before her. They respected her opinion. And this kind of thing. Now, during the course of this, though, Deborah specifically calls out for Barak. And Barak is apparently a person who is in Israel, who God has previously communicated to Barak that he wants to raise Barak up as a leader, right? And so Deborah calls Barak, and Barak is like, he doesn't want to do it. So Deborah's like, well, she calls Barak and tells him to come. And she says, look, in chapter 4, verse 6, it says, let me get to that. It says, she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go and gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun. And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you at the river Kishon with his chariots and troops, and I will give him into your hand. Like she's kind of mildly rebuking him. She's like, didn't the Lord command you to do this? You need to get it done, man. You need to get it done. Well, Barak apparently is afraid. And Barak says to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you do not go with me, I will not go. Oh, really? So here we have a recalcitrant judge, or a would-be judge. And Deborah commands him, look, you need to get on the stick here. God's told you to do something, you need to do it. Now's the time to do it. And he's like, well, I don't want to do it. I tell you what, if you go with me, then I'll go. But if you don't go with me, then I'm not going to do it. And she says, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory. In other words, you just blew it for yourself. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak musters his army, and that draws out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army of the Canaanites. And basically, when they get into their fight, and Barak routs the army of Sisera. Sisera, to the point where Sisera hops out of his chariot and he hightails it on foot, right? So he leads on foot, and he goes and he runs to somebody who he believes to be his ally, Heber the Kenite. He goes to him and he sees that his wife Jael is there, and he says, "Hey, can you hide me?" So Jael takes him, puts him in her tent, and she lays him down, covers him up, gives him some milk to drink, and he goes to sleep, thinking that he's in the hands of someone who's looking out for his best interest. And Jael promptly takes a tent peg and drives it through his head, to the point where the peg goes through his head and into the ground below him, effectively nailing him to the ground. Well, Barak and them show up, and they ask, "Hey, have you seen Sisera?" And Jael's like, "Hey, I have the guy you're looking for," and shows him, and there, lo and behold, he's in the floor of the tent with his head stuck to the ground. That's kind of brutal, It's kind of brutal. So Israel then, after the defeat, they press the attack, and they destroy King. They go all the way to destroying King Jabin of the Canaanites. And Deborah and Barak, they deliver Israel from the hand of the Canaanites. And so there's a whole chapter there about a song that commemorates this particular activity. But a question I have is this: what relevance does the story of Deborah have to the question of women serving in ministry? What relevance does the story of Deborah have to the question of women serving in ministry? Now, I ask that question because, as a Southern Baptist, as a Christian, really, my understanding from 2 Timothy, or from 1 Timothy rather, is that Paul's normal way of doing ministry is that he says, "I do not allow a woman to take authority, to teach or have authority over a man." He's speaking specifically in 1 Timothy. The whole context of that whole book, that entire book, is specifically within the operation of the church. Now, one could argue for outside of that, and this kind of thing, but he's speaking specifically within the realm of the church, and says, "I do not allow a woman to teach or have authority over a man." And since I've taken that stand, and since I let it be no secret that I hold that view, I often get people who would identify themselves as evangelicals, especially nowadays. I mean, with the Beth Moore whole thing with Beth Moore and everything, it's becoming ever more popular in evangelical circles to sort of push the envelope on what women should do in ministry, and what they should or should not be doing in ministry. And to the point where Beth Moore now, posted on her Twitter account last May that she was the one that actually gave them the Mother's Day sermon at their church at that time. And to a crowd of mixed crowd, both male and female people. So anyway, and of course, Deborah is one of the people that she looks up to, and her apologists bring up Deborah every time you talk about women not being pastors and teachers in the church. So what relevance does this story of Deborah have to the question of ministry? Well, there's a couple of things that we can see as relevant here that would inform us. We see, for example, that Deborah is called a prophetess, and a prophet in Israel functioned as an intermediate between God and people. The prophet was to speak the words of God to the people. That was the idea. And apparently, Deborah was one who God spoke through. As a woman, was one who God spoke through. Deborah also is a judge in the land. So the function that she filled was one of what we might call a civil magistrate, an Amy Coney Barrett, right? She was a judge in the land, and people would go to her with any disputes that they might have. Now, she was not a priest. She was not fulfilling the religious functions. She was fulfilling a sort of civil function. However, there really is not a lot of distinction. The judges in Israel and the kings in Israel all, likewise, were supposed to be governing from the law of God. We're supposed to be ruling from the word of God. So there really is not a hard, fast distinction there. She was not the priest or the Levite teaching the word of God, but she was bringing to bear on civil matters that came under her authority there. Deborah's husband is mentioned, and this is kind of interesting. I said before, it's kind of noteworthy because we don't hear of any of the other people's, so and so, the wife of, or the husband of, or anything like that. We do hear about Samson's wife, but of course she's part of the plot, and she's not introduced. Samson is not introduced as the husband of. I don't think his wife's name is ever given, or maybe it is. So Deborah's husband is mentioned. She is the wife of Lapidoth. Deborah is also not a military leader, even though she fulfills a function of a judge. And Barak calls her to go to raise the army with him, but she doesn't go into battle. She's never seen as doing that. Deborah is a judge when Israel is under judgment. And I think that's an important thing to notice there as well. The context of her judgeship is when Israel is under judgment. They're in rebellion against God, and now Deborah has been raised up to get them out of that. To lead them and show them the way out of that. But if you look at the book of Isaiah, Isaiah says something rather interesting. Isaiah chapter 3. Let me scroll on down here. If you look at the book of Isaiah chapter 3, in this particular book, this is, of course, Isaiah delivering prophecy, and it's in the form really of Hebrew poetry as well. But in chapter 3, verse 12, he makes this comment. He says, "My people, infants are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, your guides mislead you, and they have swallowed up the course of your paths." And he goes on to say a few things. He'll say quite a few other things as well. But here, in the midst of this prophecy that Isaiah is giving, this prophecy is about Israel at a time where they are in rebellion against God. And he's lamenting the things that are going on in the land. And he says, "My people, infants are their oppressors, or children are their oppressors, young people." In other words, it's the youth of the nation that has risen up and become the oppressors of the nation. That doesn't sound too familiar, does it? It's the youth of the nation who don't have the wisdom of the age. They don't have the wisdom of being aged. They haven't lived long enough to gain that wisdom. It's the women who are ruling over them. And that is an indication of a nation that is under the judgment of God. So to say that Deborah is a prophetess is an indictment against the people of Israel. I mean, why can't there be any faithful men to raise up and to serve in these areas? It's not saying that Deborah's a bad person for doing this. It's not saying that Deborah in and of herself is usurping authority. She's been given this authority by God. So that's not even a question here. But what we see is that her judgeship and the fact, her judgeship points to the fact that there's not a man worth his salt with a spine, not even Barak, not even the guy who God has commanded to deliver Israel. He can't even find the courage to go up to go to war against the enemy, even though God has called him to do it and commanded him to do it. He still is not going to do it unless Deborah, the judge, goes with him. That is an indictment on Israel during the time of Deborah. Deborah assumes that it's to Barak's shame that a woman will steal his glory. In other words, she assumes that he will receive that as a punishment and as a shame to himself. When she says, hey, look, because you've traveled down this road, the glory is not going to come to you, but a woman will take your glory. That is her way of shaming him. That is an indictment on Barak and his ability to lead. The reason that Deborah is the leader here in this case is because there's not a man worth his salt to do it. The only man that has half a backbone is Barak, and he only has the courage to do what God has told him to do once Deborah goes along with him. So that speaks to the severity of the situation in the book of Judges. Deborah is not an excuse to say that women can be pastors, because for one, Deborah's not a pastor. For two, she's not even a military leader. And for three, her judgeship in the land of Israel is an indictment toward Israel and their idolatry. But God does use her to get her out, to get Israel out of oppression. Well, then we come to Gideon, and Gideon is probably in the top three, right? Samson, Gideon, and Deborah are probably the top three judges known from the book of Judges. But we come to Gideon, and Gideon takes place. And this shows another instance of the cowardice of the day. But Gideon is being oppressed, and he and Israel are being oppressed by the Midianites. And the Midianites have been oppressing Israel. Israel cries out to God. God raises up Gideon. He calls Gideon. And when God calls Gideon, he's found. Do you remember what he's doing? He's threshing out wheat at a wine press. He's threshing out wheat at a wine press. And now the interesting thing about that, I know we don't live in those ages anymore where we might miss the significance of that. Usually when you threshed out wheat, you would do it on the top of a hill, because the threshing requires wind to come along and blow away the chaff, right? And then you're left with the wheat. Usually when you press wine, you would do that at the bottom of the hill, because you don't want to cart all those grapes and all the stuff up a hill, So you would the wine press would be at the bottom of the hill. So why is he threshing at the bottom of the hill? Well, the text says he's threshing at the bottom of the hill because he's afraid. He's afraid of the Midianites. Well, why is that? Well, because the Midianites, what their little particular brand of oppression is they would come out of their caves and they would come down to the people of Israel, and they would steal their food. They would steal the produce of their land. They would go and raiding parties and do that. And they'd run back to their caves, and Israel couldn't go up and assail them at their caves. It was hard to do. So Gideon is hiding from the Midianites, and God calls him. And he begins by, God tells him that God says, look, he gives very detailed instructions. I want you to go and cut down the Asherah pole and destroy the altar to Baal at your dad's house. And I want you to sacrifice the oxen that your dad uses to plow with on an altar to me. So tear down the altars and sacrifice the oxen, right? So he does that, but he chooses to do that at night, which is kind of funny. And it says that he did that at night so that nobody would see him doing it. And he tears down the altar, and he cuts down the pole, and then he goes to bed, right? And then all of a sudden the people come out the next day, and their altars destroyed, the ox are dead, the pole has been cut down, and they're like, what's going on? Well, sooner or later they find out it was Gideon that did it. He's the one that destroyed all these things, and he did it at night. And so they go and they demand the life of Gideon from his father. And his dad says, look, if Baal's so angry that his altar has been destroyed, then let Baal handle it. Gideon's dad has guts, to talk to the crowd. But it's interesting that Gideon begins that night. Gideon's kind of a timid guy. He's one of these guys, you can tell he's trying, he's trying to be brave. He's trying to do what's right, but he's just terrified of it, and so he's very, very scared. Well, the next time God comes to him, he says, okay, well, you were faithful in that, kind of. So now what I want you to do is I want you to raise an army, and I want you to go out and fight the Canaanites, who are the Midianites again. That's right. I'm sorry. I want you to go out and fight the Midianites. So he's scared to death about this, right? Gideon is scared to death, and he tells God, "Look, I'm going to have a sign from you, because if it wasn't for my dad, I'd have got killed in that last little bit. I need a sign from you, God, that this is going to be what your will is and what you want me to do." And so we're all very familiar with the whole testing of the fleece, right? So Gideon says, "Okay, God, I want you to, here's the test. I'm going to lay this fleece out, and I want you to make it so that the fleece is dry and the ground all around it is wet." And then the next day comes along. I still need another sign. I'm going to lay this fleece out, and I want the fleece to be wet and the ground around it dry. Or maybe I got this backwards in order, but basically those are the ways in which Gideon tests God, and of course God gives him the sign that he asks for. And Gideon is like, okay, well, then let's go to war, right? So Gideon raises an army, and he does pretty good. He raises an army of 32,000 people. That's a lot of people, but the Midianites number, as we see at the very end of all that happens, we see that the number of the Midianites is around 135,000. So what we have here is that's the differential, 135,000 to 32,000. That's roughly a 4-to-1 odds. For every Israelite's got to go in and kill 4 Midianites in order to win this thing, right? Before they get themselves killed. So those aren't very good odds to begin with. But Gideon raises 32,000 people, and God gives him another shocking statement. He says, "Okay, Gideon, you've got 32,000 people. That's too many. That's too many people." Mind you, we're going up against 135,000. So why does God say that's too many people? Well, God says that's too many people because God wants the glory for the battle. God says, if you do it with 32,000, 4-to-1 odds, that's too close. Then everybody's going to talk about what a great warrior you are and what a great leader you are. They're not going to talk about me. So here's what we're going to do, Gideon. I want you to tell everybody in your army of 32,000 that whoever wants to go home can go home. So Gideon asks if anybody wants to go home, and 22,000 take him up on it. So 22,000 people leave the army, and he's left with 10,000 people. And you can imagine that Gideon is probably sweating because now they've got to kill 13 people each in order for them to win the war. We're 13.5 to 1. That's the odds right now. Well, God comes along with another message. Gideon, your army's still too big. Okay, what do I do? Well, God says, here's your sign. Since you want a sign, here's what you do. You go down to the river. You tell the people tell the army to take a drink. Tell the soldiers to take a drink. And all the ones who drink it up, who lap it up who lap it up with their face in it, they got to go. But those who put them in their hands, then you can keep them. And so okay, Gideon does this, and they're left with 300 people. 300 people left, Gideon takes the remaining 300. How is he going to go with 300 people against 135,000 people? That's unbelievable. Who would in their right mind do that? That's the kind of odds God says I want to take. 300 versus 135,000 people. And so that's what they do, right? So there's 300 people, but they have a special tactic that they're going to use. They wait till it's night. Every one of them gets a torch, a trumpet, and a jar, and they put the torch in the jar so that it can't be seen by the Midianites. and they sneak up and they kind of surround the camp of the Midianites. And on the signal, everybody smashes their jar. So there's this great, huge sound of crashing pottery around them. So this sound of crashing, of the jar crashing. They see the torches, and they hear the horns blowing. Now, here's the thing about the armies of those days. They only had a limited amount of horns to blow, right? They only had a limited amount of horns to blow. And so with a particular army, you wouldn't have that many. You would have people blowing horns, but it wouldn't be that overwhelming. And so to have 300 people blowing trumpets for all the way around your camp, the Midianites are thinking the size of this army is humongous, right? That they have that many horns going, that many regiments to command, because that's really what the horns were used for, right? With that many horns going, then this army is a huge size. So they're asleep. They hear all these horns. They hear this crashing. They hear people shouting. They see the torches ringing their camp, and they believe that the Israelites have fallen on them to destroy them in their sleep. And so they get up, and in their confusion, they begin to fight one another. It says that the Lord basically turns them against each other, and they start killing each other. The Midianite people in the Midianite camp begin to do that. The enemy begins to fight itself. The enemy then, in a panic, flees. And Gideon musters the northern tribes together to not only rout the Midianites, but to destroy them. The northern tribes come out. They continue the pursuit. There's a little back and forth there. Gideon ends up trying to pursue the kings, to capture the kings. In the process of doing so, he goes through 2 different towns that he tries to get help from. And they won't give him any help because they're afraid of the Midianites. They're afraid of the kings that he's chasing. They're like, if you got the Midianite kings in your hands already? He's like, no, I don't have them yet, but I'm going to go destroy them. So finally, he catches up with them. He destroys them. He takes the kings alive back to the 2 towns that wouldn't give him any help. And he whips them with thorns on the one hand. On the other hand, he tears down one of their towers and kills the men in the city. And then he kills the kings. So that was Gideon. That's how Gideon sort of deals with all that. But that's the story of Gideon. Gideon starts out incredibly afraid. God emboldens him through a series of faithfulness in Gideon's behalf and signs on God's behalf, and to the point where God gives him a great military. Gideon then goes back and executes vengeance upon those who would not help him in that plight, because